You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today's guest is someone that I heard speaking at the Malvern Festival of Ideas. And if you think Malvern is in the middle of nowhere, well, it kind of sort of is. But it has this very high-hitting Festival of Ideas once a year. The next one's in March 2025. And the speaker didn't turn up. Or something happened to the speaker, and instead they got Remi Adekoya. And Remy, I am so delighted you were the one who turned up instead.
Thank you.
Because as I was listening to Remy talking, I was thinking all about power and privilege and how extraordinary it is to look at it through a completely different lens. So Remy, welcome to the Coaching Inn.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Just give us a little bit of your story, and then I just want to know everything you think about power and privilege. And okay. We will stop everybody before next week.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was born in Nigeria to a Nigerian father and a Polish mother. So I essentially grew up as a mixed race kid in a predominantly Black country. Nigeria is probably 99.9% Black. And so my initial experience with the whole sort of, race equation and how people on the African continent, view Europeans, view white people, was in Nigeria. And so I went to primary and secondary school in Nigeria, and I saw the way, I grew up listening to, perceptions, observations of Europeans, of the West in Nigeria, in that Nigerian context. And so from that point of view, I was able to see from a very young age what were the things about the West, Europe, that impressed people over there. And how did people over there position themselves in the grand scheme of things in sort of, that global order. Yeah. And it became quite clear to me from a young age that sort of the key thing which people found impressive about, Europe and broadly speaking, the West in Nigeria when I was growing up was the wealth essentially associated with the West, the economic development. Those were the things that really shaped the key perceptions growing up there. And so I completed secondary school in Nigeria, and this affected, also even the way people perceive me. So just to give on a personal example, so because in a Nigerian environment, whiteness is associated with privilege and with wealth. When people see me in Nigeria, they immediately can tell that I am not 100% Black. Yeah. And most people can usually tell, this guy probably has a white parent somewhere there in the background. And so because of that association with whiteness, there was generally the expectation that my family was well off. That was the immediate expectation that, since he has a white mom or dad, we don't know. People would actually know it was a white mom because my surname would tell people my dad was Nigerian.
Yeah.
And so people would immediately guess. And so the instinctive reaction would be to position me pretty high or quite high in sort of the Nigerian class system, which is very rigidly adhered to there and is essentially boils down to wealth, to who has what. So it boils down to material factors. And so that would be that instinctive reaction. And so I grew up around that, completed secondary school in Nigeria, and after that moved to Poland, my mother's home country. And there, of course, I now started experiencing race as a mixed race kid from Africa in a European context and in a very white European context, so to speak, because Poland is probably just like Nigeria, just the opposite in the sense that it's like 99.9% white. And so I grew up in Poland. I went to university in Poland and lived in Poland for many years. And there I observed perceptions of Blackness, of Black people, of Africans in Poland. And unfortunately, it was sort of made clear to me pretty early on, and there's quite crude racism, etc., which I experienced. We're talking about late 90s when I moved to Poland. The general perception was for people there to look down on anyone coming from Africa. Why? Because of the perception of a lack of economic development, that Africa is a poor continent, that Africa is underdeveloped, that Africans don't seem to be able to get their act together in terms of building successful nation states. This was the key factor that sort of determined how people in Poland, which itself was just coming out of communism at the time and was trying to transform its economy, but this was the key factor which determined how they treated and viewed people like myself from the African continent. And just to add one more thing here, which I think might be interesting, we used to complain bitterly, me and the other students of African origin, from Kenya and other places that I used to hang out with, that when Poles would, for instance, meet an African American, a Black American, they would have a different approach towards the Black American than they'd have towards us from Africa. So once that Black American opened their mouth and they heard, oh, it's an American accent, because America as a country is positioned at the absolute top of the global hierarchy, they would be all sort of rather reverential and deferential and like, oh, wow, you're from America. Oh, wow, from New York. Oh, wow, California, we heard that so nice. Completely different approach, different response to us who were the same skin color, but, Africa, poor, etc., etc. Yeah.
So much interesting stuff there. Do you know, when I was listening to you in Malvern, I wrote down in my notebook, Insight 1.
Yes.
If you want some really good insights on culture, always ask somebody who wasn't born here and wasn't born there. Because, in fact, I've used the story in conversation with somebody recently who said, I wonder who could help me with this question. And I said, it was an international question. I said, don't ask somebody who was born in that country, and don't ask somebody who was born in that country. Ask somebody who lives there, who looks through a different set of glasses.
Exactly. I'd say that. And so that's experienced that, like I say, in the Nigerian context, experienced it in the Polish context. And I traveled around Europe. I worked later as a journalist in Poland. And so I traveled quite extensively sort of around continental Europe and, the France and Denmark and Netherlands and these countries, and sort of, observed also what seemed to be the dynamics there before finally moving to the UK in 2015. So I've lived in the UK for 9 years now.
When you were talking about being in Nigeria, you were talking about people giving you power and shooting you up the privilege rank.
Yes.
Because you had a white mother. And one of the things that I notice a lot in the work that I do around dialogue is that we're all different, and people give or take away privilege depending on what you look like, what you sound like, what's on your CV, all of those things. So I'm just really curious for you to share some of your insights about money. Everybody, you need to listen to Remy's book. It's not about whiteness, it's about wealth. It's extraordinary.
Thank you very much. And so about money. So let's start from the Nigerian context again. Like I say, instinctive sort of associations with wealth or with money because of the white white factor, and that stemmed from those associations of whiteness with wealth. And of course, someone may say here that, but it's not all white majority nations that are wealthy or very wealthy. I mean, you do have nations like Ukraine, Belarus, etc., that are not mega wealthy nations. But of course, those nations are not that well known on the African continent. The nations that are known are the nations that colonized countries in Africa, are the sort of famous white majority nations. So the association of the regular Nigerian associates, whiteness, quote unquote, with, the Britons, the Frances, the USAs, the Canadas, the Germanys, and those really well-known countries that often either had empires in the past and had connections with Africans and those are sort of the white people they know. And so so there is that sort of impression, which is, of course, to a certain degree, a stereotype, that pretty much all white people are well off. Yeah, so like I said, obviously there's other countries among the European countries that is not the case. But what matters in shaping people's everyday behavior is what they think.
Yeah.
Is their perceptions. Doesn't necessarily have to be 100% reality. So there was that. And then, when I got to Poland, we'd sit around with my friends, like I say, fellow Nigerian students or other students from Africa. And, we'd always sort of, be frustrated, like I say, the kind of racism we experienced when we got to Poland, especially, like I say, late 90s, early 2000s, etc. We, like, well, why do these people look down on us like this? Where does all this come from? And of course, we had all heard of racism and knew stories, obviously, about slavery, colonialism, etc. But, the more we discussed it, the more we saw that really today, what it comes down to is that their perception that, there's that lack of economic development, that, we quote unquote, on the African continent are, not well organized, can't get our act together, etc., etc. That really, that is the fundamental problem. And, sometimes even friends of mine from Nigeria would say, well, it's not their fault. After all, why would I be in Poland? Some of my Nigerian friends would say, why would I be in Poland if not for the fact that there's so many problems in Nigeria in the first place? So indeed, if Nigeria was a successful country, my friends would say, who had no Polish connections, because, I at least had a Polish mother, and there was some kind of rationale for me to go to Poland in the mid-90s as a kid who grew up in Nigeria. But for other Nigerians there, or people from other African countries who were, let's say, 100% Kenyan or Nigerian, they'd say, yeah, well, at the end of the day, they are right, because, why would we even be here in the first place if our countries were doing well? We wouldn't even be in Poland. My fellow Nigerian would say, why would I come to study at a Polish university? There's no connection really between, Nigeria and Poland. So, so at the end of the day, we did know that we are at a disadvantage, sort of materially, structurally, because of where our nations were sort of materially and structurally, and that was what gave, the Poles at the time, who, like I say, were not even themselves doing terribly well. Now Poland is doing, of course, much better, and it's been an economic success. But even who at the time were not themselves doing terribly well, to feel that they have the right to, to look down on us. And, it's a terrible thing. And one can, of course, argue, so for me, in a perfect world, people should never be assessed by where they are positioned materially, whether on an individual basis or on a national basis. I would love for us to live in a world in which one human being meets another human being, and they look them in the eye and converse with them like they're conversing with a simple another human being, without wondering, where is this person positioned in the global, status hierarchy? Are they up there or are they down there, etc.? Unfortunately, human beings tend to be hierarchical creatures. We are hierarchical creatures. And there's lots of work has been done on this in evolutionary, biology and social psychology, etc., that essentially, societies are hierarchically structured to a greater or lesser extent. Those hierarchies are maintained more aggressively in some societies than they are in other societies. And so internally, I don't have to tell you, as a British person, there is a class system here in Britain.
Yeah.
And, that class system used to be much more aggressively imposed than it is today. Today, it's less aggressively imposed, of course. It's more subtle, but it's still there. Everybody knows it's still there. And every society has such a system, it's such a status system. And then that's internally. And then between nations, you also have a global hierarchy. No one is going to argue that Armenia is seen in the same light as America. Yeah. Or that Britain is seen in the same light as Burundi. There are clear national hierarchies here at play, and there are clearly some nations that are able to do more, that have more leverage in the world, in international politics, etc., and some that have less. And and so I started trying to think, okay, so where does this come from? What's actually the core of it? What gives one nation, and because most nations are at the end of the day usually populated by a majority racial group. Yeah. So in Nigeria, it's Black people who are the majority racial group. In Britain, it's white people who are the majority racial group. In Denmark, same, etc. And so I'm thinking, okay, so what is it? Where does that leverage really come from? Where does that power really come from? And I came to the conclusion that, when you strip back all the, the rhetoric and the words and the ideas, etc., it does come down to material power. And in a capitalist world, material power comes down to wealth. Yeah. Much of the reasons why the US can do what it does and dominate the way it does is because it's the largest economy in the world. Because it's the largest economy in the world, it can afford to have the strongest military in the world and spend hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on, all sorts of missiles and training all sorts of soldiers, etc., etc., And so that kind of military strength that enables it to do what it does essentially comes down, to wealth. And the UK today has still a strong position in the world. And of course, some of it is historical. The UK, of course, enjoys some soft power and other attributes like that. But also the UK remains as relevant as it is, largely due to the fact that it's still an economically successful nation. It's still the, I think, sixth largest economy in the world. If the UK today, imagine the UK today, let's say something hypothetically, some disaster had happened, some economic catastrophe had happened to the UK, say 15, 20 years ago. And today, the UK economically was no wealthier than Bulgaria. Does anybody honestly think that the UK would have the position it has in the international system today if it was no wealthier than Bulgaria, even with all its past? That past wouldn't matter that much in that case. Let me give you an example. Portugal used to be a great empire. Portugal used to be a great empire. The Portuguese controlled, Brazil, colonized many parts of the world, were a sea power. Today, Portugal is a small country that is generally not considered incredibly relevant in terms of global affairs. Nobody wakes up and says, oh, what does Portugal think about this? Yeah, that's the reality, even though it has that history. But today, it does not have the economic means to be a major actor in global affairs.
So many questions, so many insights. I think, we've talked about the global level, and interestingly, as you've talked a lot about, you began talking about people giving you power.
Yes.
And there's something about people looking up to people and looking down at people, isn't there?
That's it.
And how do we level up? And yet it's hard to level up when somebody is putting us down or putting us up.
Yes.
Getting that level isn't actually entirely in my gift, is it? Or in your gift, or in whoever's gift.
Of course, exactly. Because like you say, and quite rightly, the hierarchies that function in this world, they don't only function because those at the top want them to function that way. To a certain extent, yes. But they also function because those who position themselves lower or who are positioned lower look up to certain people. Yeah. And when they look up to those people, they elevate those people. And when they elevate those people obviously enjoy more status than them, more power and privilege than them, etc. Simple example, who do people look up to, let's say on an individual basis, here in Britain? People look up to those described as very successful people. So if you're a very successful entrepreneur, you've built a business, from nothing, etc. People immediately like, oh wow, that's a somebody. Of course, celebrities, famous actors, people who enjoy fame. People also here in Britain look up to those, even though everybody moans about them. But I've noticed that people here in Britain look up to those who went to those private schools, who went to the Etons and who later went to, the Oxfords and the Cambridge. People moan about them. But I've noticed that, because I've been at, many sort of events, conferences, debates, etc. And I see sort of, when there's somebody there who has that kind of background here in Britain, who speaks the way, people speak, who went to Eton, Oxford, Cambridge, has that confidence because they have a certain sort of confidence about them and self-assuredness. I do see that people tend to pay attention to what they say. People tend to pay attention to what they say more than they might pay attention to someone who comes from a different background here in Britain, from a more sort of, working class background and things like that. And so those things work, which, like I say, I also try to understand once, why is it? Because one could ask, okay, why would, because every hierarchy obviously can have only a small group at the absolute top, and then you'll have people in roughly the middle, and then you'll have quite a large group of people in the lower rungs. So one could ask logically, why do people accept this? Why don't those in the lower rungs who usually serve the majority, why don't they say, no, we're not going to agree to this. We have the number, so we're not going to accept it. And there's various sort of theories around this. But generally, what evolutionary biology at least seems to suggest is that human beings, have developed these kinds of systems, strata systems, over the lots of years now, in order to organize themselves theoretically as effectively as possible. And that's why every society sort of accepts a kind of rulership class, or a kind of ruling elite who are supposed to organize things and organize the other kind of people. And once that sort of ruling class was chosen on a, quote unquote, royal blood basis. So if you had what's called blue blood, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but if you had what used to be called blue blood, you were royalty, and then you were one of those who were supposed to organize society and decide how things work. Of course, that now evolved into a meritocracy to greater or lesser extent. We can discuss how meritocratic Britain really is, etc. But it's definitely more meritocratic than it was 100, 150 years ago. And so today, at least theoretically, it's supposed to be the most competent people who are supposed to be positioned there at the top. The most competent, the smartest people. Those are the people who society has accepted that, we can agree for them to be the ministers, the prime ministers, and the people running things. And this, of course, makes some sense because generally, probably you do want more competent, you want the most competent people sort of running your society, not the least competent people. But of course, then we can now go into the question of, okay, who is deemed competent and who not? And what's the criteria? And here we come into those, psychological things and why, for instance, people who have that Eton background and Oxbridge background, and, they speak very well. They're often very eloquent, often, know a lot in terms of knowledge. They've, read the classics and all that. And, when they open their mouth and speak, people are often like, oh, wow, he or she definitely knows more than I do. And so there's lots involved there, but the hierarchies are, there's a pecking order everywhere, essentially.
Yes. And you've just described the coaching profession, which is often, but not always, the work goes to the people who look as though or sound as though they've got more power, even though it's a profession that requires a level of equality and partnership in order for people to engage in dialogue.
That's it. That's that's the way the human psyche works. So if people hear that, there is this life coach, and he or she wrote a book and it sold 3, 4 million, 5 million copies, 10 million copies, they're like, oh wow, that person definitely must know what they're talking about. And when that life coach walks into the room and opens their mouth, people they're going to hang on to every word almost, because success. So the person must be absolutely great at what they do. That might be the case. It perhaps does not always have to be the case, or perhaps there might be other life coaches there who haven't written a book that has sold 5 million or 10 million copies, but may have equal wisdom to that person who has, or perhaps even more. But just because, that sort of, they haven't had that particular kind of, success, people will, like it or not, people will somehow look up more to the one who sold that 5, 10 million copies with the assumption that they probably know more.
So the looking up and the looking down is a really strong theme, isn't it? Have you read Robert Fuller's work?
I'm not sure I have. I don't think so, no.
Robert Fuller was an academic, and he wrote a book called Somebodies and Nobodies.
Yes.
And he says that if you somebody,
yes, good, nice.
That we flip between. It's really interesting work, and that if I have to be somebody, then I have to make you nobody. And if you have to be somebody, then you make me nobody. So it's a really interesting insight into what all of the things that we've been saying on a kind of meta level in this conversation, isn't it? And bringing it right back down to the two people in the room at the same time.
Right, definitely. Those things happen, those psychological processes, like you say, of somebody in somebody or nobody in somebody, they happen, I think, very often, even subconsciously.
Absolutely.
Even subconsciously. It's not like people wake up in the morning, and most people are not mean people. Most people are generally decent, good people in my sort of observations. And, it's not like people wake up in the morning and say, aha, I'm going to treat those who are, wealthy or successful, etc., much better today than I'm going to treat those who are not. People don't even do this consciously. It's just, it's that, those, like I say, hierarchical instincts in us that just, sort of are triggered or just come up when somebody like that walks into the room, like I say, who's sold 10 million copies or built a great billion pound business. And there's just a dynamic, that sort of something that just triggers in people's brains when somebody like that comes in, compared to, if somebody who they see as, just let's say a regular person like them, quote unquote.
Yeah. So many things to talk about. I'm just curious, where's your research taking you now, Remy?
Well, I'd say right now I'm taking a little bit of a break, but I'm getting more interested. Yes. Now I'm taking a little bit of my break, spending some more time with the family, etc. But I'm definitely still interested in sort of, status hierarchies and, and how they work and sort of, how, they can be leveled. Yeah. And that's why, I argue in the book that unfortunately, I completely wish it were different. If we're talking about leveling up, the status, if we're thinking in racial categories, that I unfortunately think it will not happen to a satisfactory enough extent until Black African nations become successful. Until we have at least a few very successful Black African nations. Because at the end of the day, if we're thinking, like I say, in racial categories, and if we're focused on the sort of Black-white issue, there's obviously various other racial groups and ethnicities out there. Just 3% of the Black people in this world live in America and Britain combined. Just 3%. 90% of the Black people in this world live in Africa. And then there's another 7% scattered around Latin America, especially in Brazil and other countries in South America and the Caribbean, etc. So there is no way we are going to fundamentally change that sort of status positioning of Blackness, that instinctive status positioning of Blackness in the world, excuse me, without changing the lot, the realities, and the leverage, the negotiating position of the 90% who live on the African continent. For me, it's just not going to happen unless we do that. And that's why I try to, emphasize, and why when I talk about the race issue, I'm definitely not only speaking to white people, so to say, or to others, but I'm very much trying to speak also to Black people, to people of African origin, to understand that, look, there is only so far we can get in this whole equality dynamic on moral arguments. There's only so far we can get on moral arguments, because that's really pretty much what's been our major arsenal in the last in the last couple of decades. It's moral arguments that we say, oh, status hierarchies are wrong, looking down on people from a different race is wrong, etc. And of course, I 300% agree with that. And that has moved the needle a bit. I'm not saying it hasn't moved the needle at all. It definitely has. And attitudes towards, Black people and people of color, people from the poorer global South countries, are definitely way different today in a Britain or an America or a France or a Germany than they used to be 50, 60 years ago. There's no doubt about that. But that needle has not moved as far enough as it has to move. And this is evidenced by the sort of feelings, very strong feelings in many people of Black descent and of people of brown skin color and other skin colors who complain about how they think they are looked down on every day if we go to social media. Yeah, you have people of African descent saying, complain about racism and how people, view them and position them and the negative stereotypes about them and all that. And it's the reason why when that Black Lives Matter thing erupted, when George Floyd was killed in America, I mean, one thing that really struck me, I wasn't surprised by the reactions of, African American Twitter, or even of Black British Twitter. But, I did find sort of not shocking, but revealing the attitudes of African Twitter. Yeah. So I interact a lot with, Africans on Twitter, and a lot of my followers are, from Nigeria and other African countries, and they were up in arms. And they sort of really connected with that Black Lives Matter slogan, even though a Nigerian living in Nigeria doesn't have to fear anything from a white police officer, because there are no white police officers in Nigeria. Neither are there any white police officers in Kenya. So if you look at it from that perspective, this wasn't really, quote unquote, their fight. Yeah, it's the fight of the African Americans living in America who have to deal with white police officers. So you have to ask yourself, so what's the connection then? Why would a Kenyan, be so concerned or so outraged at what happened, to George Floyd, or a Nigerian, etc.? And it comes from that feeling that, generally speaking, as Black people, the world tends, or many people in the world tends to look down on the Black race, and that these kinds of things are considered possible, and that it is, the world feels that Black lives matter less than the lives, for instance, of white people. That feeling is shared by the Kenyan living in Kenya, the Zambian living in Zambia, the Nigerian living in Nigeria, and the African American living in America, and sometimes also the Black Briton living here in Britain. So that's the connecting thread,
Thank you. We could talk all day, Remy. How do people get your book, or how do they follow you on Twitter as well?
So I'm at Remi Adekoya 1.
Great.
So at Remi Adekoya 1, and the book is available on Amazon. It's available, I think, on some other definitely stores. So definitely easiest link is through Amazon.
Brilliant. I'll put all that in the show notes, everyone. Remy, thank you so much for coming. And I know that you will be stimulating more conversation about what the meta conversation that we've had this morning really how that impacts the partnership one-to-one conversations that we have every day. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. That went so quickly. I didn't even notice the time.
And thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.